a discussion about compassionate use, also known as expanded use. We have to know that these are just different terms for the same thing, compassionate use or expanded access. And we're going to hear a presentation by Dr. Ratan from MD Anderson Cancer Center, with comments from Amanda Hoffman, who is a beneficiary of expanded access. Dr. Ratan.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Jean, and thank you to DTRF for hosting this wonderful event and for having us here. It's really a privilege, and I'm really excited to come and talk to you folks today and answer your questions. Try to keep my comments brief. I'm trying to introduce the topic, but I think the discussion is the fun part, and I really want to hear what Amanda has to say as well. Just quickly, disclosures, I do in the course of my work interact with some drug companies, including some that do things in the desmoid space. I don't think it's going to impact what I'm talking about here. And I want to say very clearly that I'm not discussing any specific drug here. I'm trying to discuss the process generally about getting compassionate or expanded access to medicines. Okay, this is not a history lesson, but I think that the context is helpful, right? So why do we do it this way? Why is the research process that Dr. Chug sort of discussed with you folks previously so labor intensive? And the answer is that there have been historical incidents that have caused harm to patients, right? So 1960s, when thalidomide is widely used to treat nausea in pregnant women, that is sort of what women are told to use it for. We find out, it's sort of through the 50s it's used, in the 60s we find out that it causes devastating birth defects. And so around this time, Congress charges the FDA, which existed back then, but had a very different job. It didn't approve drugs the way that it does now, to ensure that drugs that are marketed are both safe and effective. And the process that's put into place has some very positive benefits in terms of making sure that we have a better understanding, I should say, of the drugs that we use to treat patients, but it delays the availability of drugs. You can't just create a therapy and give it to patients widely. And the 1980s, a new challenge arises, which is the HIV epidemic. And so, many of us who were younger then will still remember that patients in the 80s who had HIV, it was a death sentence. It's not that way anymore. It's still a very challenging disease. But as therapies, some of which ended up being quite effective, became available, there was an outcry to make these therapies available to patients and not wait 7 to 10 years to get them approved by the FDA. And so the FDA at that point really fleshes out this compassionate use procedures pathway to facilitate drugs for HIV patients. And that then is used for other serious diseases like cancer, metabolic diseases, ALS, neurological diseases. And the current regulations around expanded use, also called compassionate access, are put into place in 2009. Okay, and something folks may have heard about just in the last few years, 2014 to 2018, is so-called right to try laws, which are related but separate from this FDA pathway, which are passed at the state level in something like 40 or 41 states, and then federally in 2018. And I'll tell you that these basically limit the liability of people like insurance, the physician, the company that's providing drug, and try to ease some of the regulatory burden. But as I sort of talked about earlier, some of that regulatory burden exists to protect patients. And so I would tell you that the implementation of these right to try laws has been pretty limited. So that's a history lesson. I think it's helpful context to sort of talk about why it's not necessarily so straightforward to get compassionate access to drugs. But let's talk a little bit about the actual pathway, okay? So expanded access is a Food and Drug Administration, FDA pathway that allows patients access to experimental medicines, okay? It is a resource and time-intensive process, which is similar to the clinical trial process that Dr. Chug just discussed, with some modifications, and it absolutely requires going through a physician. So this is not a situation where a patient or a loved one can take it upon themselves to approach a drug company saying, I would like for you to give me the drug. You have to go through a treating physician, okay? And these are the criteria right off the FDA website. It's for patients with immediately life-threatening or serious disease or condition to get access to the medical product. The patient should not have any comparable or satisfactory alternative. The patient shouldn't be eligible for the clinical trial with the agent, and that's really important, right? So as John and Dr. Chug just discussed, if you're running a study which is required potentially by the FDA to be 50% placebo and 50% drug, we don't want to shunt patients to just getting compassionate access to that drug, because then that trial will never get done. The drug will not be widely available to other patients. And so you don't want to cannibalize a clinical trial by making it widely available prior to that being available, to say nothing of the fact that we don't know if that's safe. And so that next criterion is that the potential benefit of the drug has to outweigh potential risks. And that can be very squishy. For some drugs, it's that we have some early phase, maybe phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trial data that shows some signs of effectiveness and gives us some sense of how safe the drug is. In other cases, in very unusual situations, it may be that there's just a scientific rationale for why trying this makes sense, and nothing else is available to that patient. That's less common in the desmoid space, but I'm sure you can imagine this being the case in certain neurological diseases, and certainly was true for some agents during the COVID-19 pandemic early on, before we had a whole lot of data. So there's three sort of broad options that the FDA allows for. And the most common one that we do in the desmoid space, and this changes based on sort of where different drugs are in their approval process, is what's called a single patient IND. And that's a fancy way of saying that we basically open a single patient clinical trial. The FDA has to approve it. They review the application. The company providing the drug reviews the application. We generate some of the paperwork, and I'll talk about that. And so, as you can imagine, that quickly becomes limiting if you're doing these for 20 or 30 or 40 patients in a practice. And so there are pathways to do this on a larger scale. So intermediate sized patient population protocols will allow, the FDA will allow a company or a center to treat tens, maybe even hundreds of patients without having to go back each time to get separate approvals. And then finally, there's expanded access for widespread use. And this is typically for drugs that have a lot more information regarding their safety and efficacy, but are not yet FDA approved. This is a way that the company can make the drug widely available when there's a real need for it. So on the patient side, I think that there's a couple things that are to be aware of. So access to a experimental therapy is not available on demand. And in fact, there really isn't an obligation for the pharmaceutical company or the FDA or the center to make it available at all. And so you can't sort of just go in and say, I want access to this drug, because very often that may not be possible. It's important to recognize that as an experimental agent, we don't have a full handle on the side effects and how likely it is to help you. And when you go to a physician, especially if it's someone that you haven't seen before, and request compassionate access to a drug, my obligation in that situation is to have a really thorough conversation with you about the other treatment options that are available, and to offer you the treatments that are not experimental as a first step. And indeed, that's a condition that's often set by the FDA and the sponsors that are providing the drug. On the company side, the company's looking after the developmental program. They want to get a drug, study it fully, get it approved by the FDA, and bring it to the market. And there's a theoretical risk if you have a patient who is not as carefully selected as a clinical trial patient, going on a medicine, having a bad experience, which could then potentially, although not terribly likely to, have consequences in terms of that drug getting approved, or certainly just getting a bad rap in the public. And as I mentioned earlier, easy access to experimental medicine may prevent a patient from enrolling in clinical trials. That being said, the opposite consideration is also true, right? If there's a really promising therapy, making sure that there's a robust, compassionate access pathway available for patients who don't qualify for your clinical trial can be helpful in ensuring that physicians don't feel pressured to sort of put patients who really shouldn't be on a clinical trial, and there's different reasons for that we can talk about, on a trial. So there are good reasons as well that can actually help some aspects of your study, although enrollment can be impacted. Smaller companies may just not have enough drug kicking around. I mean, it costs money to make drug. They are trying to get their trials done. That has to be their priority. So they may choose not to make a drug available simply because they don't have enough available. There's geographic considerations here. I mean, most of this talk is sort of targeted at a US audience, but I recognize we have people coming in from many different countries. And these expanded access programs are regulated different in different countries. Companies may, especially smaller ones, may not be able to operate in very many, providing compassionate access to drugs. That being said, having patients on treatment with good experiences is great PR. It's a way to get buzz out about your drug. And I think that certainly people who work at pharmaceutical companies also have an altruistic desire to help the community. I mean, a lot of people are in it to help the patients. And so I think that there's lots of reasons why they want to do this and some why they might not. I will tell you, as a doctor who takes care of a lot of patients with desmoids and does a lot of compassionate access when it's appropriate, it's a labor-intensive process. So my job when someone is going on compassionate access for a drug is to file with the FDA, to file with the company that controls the drug, and to also file internally with mechanisms that we have to make sure that what we are offering a patient is safe. And those are called internal review boards, which are the same committees that oversee clinical trials to make sure that patients are being cared for properly. So that's similar to the process that Dr. Chugg discussed earlier. I will tell you, it is a little bit more concise. We don't have to write an 80-page protocol on every patient, but we do have to write a protocol. We do have to come up with an informed consent document that we go through with the patient. And then there are reporting requirements. If patients have side effects, we have to notify the company, potentially the FDA, and potentially the internal review boards. So this does create an administrative burden. And different from clinical trials, this is not paid for. So when we're running a clinical trial for a company or with a company, a lot of those costs are covered by the company that's sponsoring the clinical trial. And that is typically not the case with compassionate access, though we're using the same people and sort of similar man hours. And so, having 30 patients on compassionate access protocols can actually, gum up the works and potentially slow activation of our clinical trials that might get a drug approved. So, key messages that I'm trying to convey are that expanded access or compassionate use, whatever you want to call it, it's considered extraordinary. It's not a standard of care. It's not an obligation for a company to provide it or for a physician to provide it. And it's generally meant for patients who've exhausted other options. The best way to get access to experimental treatment, if you're eligible, is to get on the clinical trial, although we fully recognize that there are significant reasons why you might not want to do that. And I would mention that if some of those reasons are medical, things like you can't take pills, to use Dr. Chugg's example, or your tumor, it would be unsafe if it progressed by the amount necessary in order to cross over to the different treatment arm in a trial, as John alluded to, those might be reasons that you are not appropriate for a clinical trial and may qualify for compassionate access if you've exhausted other treatments. So in the right setting, it really can provide access to important treatments to patients in need. And there are success stories out there. And I'm happy to talk or have Amanda talk about hers. And I'll stop there and hand it over and be looking forward to answering your questions in a few minutes.
Amanda, the time is yours. Be sure to unmute. Unmute.
That's what happens when I wait too long. Just sit there on mute. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. That was such an educational presentation for me, and I'm one of the people who's benefiting from this. That was great to know the context and the history and everything. So thank you, Dr. Ratan. I'm also a cat lover, just, so John doesn't feel alone here. But I just want to start out by saying, as John said, this is my personal experience. I know that this is not the same for everyone. A lot of things might be the same, but of course, everyone's going to have a different journey. And as Dr. Ratan pointed out, depending on your specific case, this just might be very different. So just want to say that off the top. This term compassionate use just meant something so different to me before just a couple of years ago. I mean, when I heard the word compassionate use, I'm thinking people who are terminally ill and not someone like me who's, just having a lot of pain and issues in my daily life with my disease, but I just didn't think that I even came close to that. So it was very enlightening to understand that this program is for people like us too, who have very few options available for our treatment. So I've had my tumors for 15 years, and I had surgery way back in the day and had a near immediate recurrence, and then have been dealing with those subsequent tumors ever since. But about 2 years ago, I had a new tumor pop up. So that was definitely considered, significant new growth. And I was having a lot of mobility issues and pain, and it was very debilitating and starting to deeply affect my life. And so I started to think of what options were at my disposal, because I'd already tried a number of chemotherapies that just did not work at all. I'd tried doing nothing for a while. I'd, tried all sorts of different things. And I knew there were only a few options left on the table. And I had actually been in a clinical trial 5 years previously. And so I know firsthand what John's experiencing. And I did very well on that trial with that therapy and did have to leave the trial due to some side effects. But I was always hoping that one day soon that drug would be available again and that I would maybe be able to take it again. And so I heard about expanded access with that drug that I benefited from and thought, am I even possibly a candidate for this? And so I spoke with my care team, and this was in just December of last year, we started this process. And, I was evaluated and we just talked about everything I tried and what was left on the table. And they agreed that they thought this made sense to pursue for me in my position. And I was getting to the point where I couldn't walk and I was crawling up the stairs. I mean, I was definitely having some severe issues. So I was grateful to hear that this was a possibility, no guarantee when they start the process. There is no guarantee. You just kind of wait and see what will happen. And so I'm really glad that Dr. Ratan's here to explain all the things that happened that were kind of in a black box for me, because as a patient, you don't get to know every single detail. And obviously a lot is going on behind the scenes, but I was just told basically, we're going to start this process. It's going to take, probably 1 to 2 months, but between getting the FDA approval and the drug company approval and all of these things. And so I just waited, but I was, hopeful. And I found out, I think probably in early February, that it was approved by the drug company. And then there were some more steps to take. And so I actually switched doctors in this period. And I do, have to wonder if that was kind of helpful for me, because the initial doctor I was seeing was actually the principal investigator, so like the manager of that trial for that therapy at my institution. And so he was very familiar with this drug, very familiar with the drug company. Not to say that someone who isn't the PI could certainly do this, but I just think that might have been a little bit in my favor. And then I switched doctors, but it was luckily a seamless process. They handed over the process to my new physician because my previous physician was leaving. And we just continued on. And it didn't seem, luckily in my case, didn't seem to affect the timeline. And so I think about early March was when I finally got the A-OK. I had signed my consent. Since I had been in a clinical trial before, I kind of knew some of the way things were going to go. You sit with this giant document, they go through every page and tell you everything about it. I had worked very closely with my physician, and I don't know if this is a standard thing or not, but I had worked very closely with my physician to write the protocol for my own little one-person clinical trial, which is how they kept describing it. And that was amazing. I just thought that's the most involved in my care I think I've been in a long time. So we decided on how flexible we'd be with dosing, what kind of breaks I could take, et cetera. And it really, it made me feel so good about what I was entering into. And so that was extremely comforting. And the only hang-up that I ran into, and I think this is really important because I didn't expect it, is that my insurance company rejected paying for anything that I needed that had to do with me being on this drug initially. And my team was very shocked by that. I was very shocked by that, but then again, not so much because it's an insurance company and they're always a pain. But my doctors submitted an appeal and they asked for it to be an urgent appeal because I had already waited months for this to all come together. They decided that they were not going to be urgent about it and they were going to take their sweet time and take up to 4 weeks to review it. And so that was frustrating, obviously. It's just kind of like a running, and then have to stop and kind of put everything on pause. But luckily within, I believe it was about 3 weeks, we got the okay and I was able to move forward. And so, and all that means is because the drug company is paying for the drug. It's not like your insurance company has to pay for it, but they were having an issue with the idea of paying for all of the things that come with it. So like what John was saying in his clinical trial, that there are extra MRIs or if there's extra blood work or whatever, some of it might be paid for by the drug company, but a lot of it would be paid by his insurance company. Same thing with this situation. And so they just thought, well, she's going to go on this, experimental drug. She's going to have issues. We're going to have to pay for all this stuff, and we don't want to. So having a care team that is really ready to go to bat for you in case that comes up. In my case, they were fantastic and it worked out. But just want to put that out there as something that could happen. And then really the first few months were very much like a clinical trial in the sense that I had frequent check-ins, blood work. I did have 3-month MRIs, and we're still doing 3-month MRIs at this point since I just started earlier this year. But possibly by next year, we may change that. It may be less frequent. And also because it is a drug that is not, widely available, you are only given so much when you first are given the drug, and at least for the first, few months into it. So you might get 1 bottle, which means that you would have to physically go back and get the bottle, or maybe they would mail it to you depending on where you are. And then after a certain period, which I think for me was this summer, I was able to get, 3 months worth of the drug because they had seen I was doing okay. We had adjusted the dosage. We were kind of in a good space. And so I was able to kind of be a little more free in that sense. And I'll, come back again to get another 3 months worth or so. Just see here. I feel like I might be forgetting something. They do. Oh, yeah, I was just going to mention real quick that you do have a diary as well, which is similar to a clinical trial. And it's not as critical, I feel like, as the clinical when you're in a bigger clinical trial, but they do want you to obviously record your experience.
Thanks so much, Amanda, Dr. Ratan. Very, very helpful. Before we move into questions, I just want to introduce Amanda. She's worked with the foundation for years as a volunteer, and now she's marketing and social media director for us. So every post you get from DTRF has Amanda behind it, and she does such great things for us. So we're thankful to you for what you do for DTRF and for sharing your story. Manish, let's move into questions.
Sure. The first question is for you, Dr. Ratan. You mentioned that this is an FDA pathway, so the assumption is that this is US only. Are you aware of a similar pathway in other countries, specifically in Canada?
Yeah, so I guess my knowledge of the Canadian regulations is somewhat limited, although I would bet dollars to donuts that there is such a pathway available. Now, I doubt, I can't speak to any specific drug because a company has to choose to make it available in that country. But yeah, I mean, such a pathway I'm certain exists. I apologize for not having more details on that.
That's okay. Would you suggest going to a company's website to find out, or maybe the country's equivalent of the FDA website to try to get more information?
I guess my suggestion would be that, I mean, certainly looking at company websites and so forth is good, and a lot of patients have great patient-facing information. I think your best option, honestly, is to seek consultation with someone who takes care of a lot of patients with desmoids, right? Because they're going to have some sense of what's available and what's not. For some of those drugs that are commonly accessed in the compassionate access space, they'll likely know sort of what's involved. So, I guess my bias is clear, but I think that your treating physician is probably your best resource, especially if they take care of a lot of patients with desmoids.
Great. And then I have a question for Amanda. You mentioned that it took a couple of months from the time where you put in the application and then it was approved. Can you tell us more about during those couple of months, how you were feeling? Were you on a different treatment during those months, or no treatment?
I wasn't. And that was difficult. I mean, and I think, depending on what situation you're in, that's going to be more difficult for some people than others, right? I was doing my best to manage my pain with some, kind of things to manage my symptoms, but I was in kind of rough shape. So it was a fingers crossed situation and waiting and hoping. I know that wouldn't be the case for some people. And actually, maybe Dr. Ratan can mention this. If I had needed to do something in that period, I'm not sure what the rule would be in that case. But I personally didn't have to be on anything and just kind of toughed it out.
So, I mean, you're writing the protocol. And so I think in theory, you could be on something. I think the challenge that often comes is that the reason that you're seeking compassionate access is there isn't necessarily a clear something to be on. And I think that's the larger frustration and the larger challenge, right? Is that you're waiting for a period of time. This is not always a fast process. It rarely is for unless you're in an immediately life-threatening situation. In which case it, by the way, can sometimes be sped up. So I think that's the challenge, right? Is identifying something to be on when you're seeking compassionate access, because there may not be an alternative readily apparent.
Yeah.
And then also during that process, Dr. Ratan, in your presentation, you mentioned there's a lot of different
Yeah.
regulations you have to do, company, FDA. So this question is actually for Amanda. How much communication did you get about that process from your physician, or were you just kind of waiting until the end?
Yeah, not a whole lot. The physician who initiated the process did, after we decided, okay, we're going to go forward with this, he called me a couple weeks into it to just ask me some more questions, because we had just started to have a patient-doctor relationship. I was seeing someone else before that who left, so I went through a lot of transitions. But I just gave him my history basically, and that was kind of the only part that I feel like I was able to take part in. Other than that, so much is going on behind the scenes, and I would get updates, which was nice. I had the team would keep me posted and just send me a note or give me a call and say, hey, this is still going on, we're just waiting for this or whatever. But yeah, it is just kind of being patient. And, I'd say, if things, I have talked to other patients who this process took much, much, much longer. And I don't obviously know the details of why, but as Dr. Ratan mentioned, it's an incredibly labor intensive process. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, depending on what your institution or your sarcoma center has the resources for. I imagine this could vary pretty widely. And I think it makes sense. I don't want to say that you as a patient are completely at the mercy of this, that you can call and check in. I think that's okay. And I think I did, maybe now and then, to just say, hey, just curious about an update, and not to be annoying, but just to say, hey, I kind of want to know where we are. I think that's totally fair. You have to advocate for yourself in that way.
It's a struggle sometimes to know what to tell patients. I think it's of limited utility for most people to hear that their application is currently with Bob at the IRB office. That doesn't mean anything, right? Yeah. And so I think you're always welcome to reach out and say, hey, is this still cooking? And we're happy to tell you that it is, right? But yeah, that is a challenge, right? Because waiting is tough, especially when you have something that you may have symptoms from that you have struggled with for some time. So it's never a bother to sort of reassure someone that things are moving, but you may not get real-time updates about sort of where it is moving through the bureaucracy.
Maybe you can comment on that duration of time. Is 1 to 2 months pretty typical, or what's the range that might be expected?
So there's just different bottlenecks, right? So speaking to compassionate access generally, right? If you are in a situation where you need to get a drug in a week or two to prevent you from dying, is there sometimes a way to make this move really fast? The answer is yes, right? And there are lethal conditions for which that is done. Now, in the desmoid space, is that what you should expect? No, right? I think that the bottlenecks can vary. They can be institutional based on how long the IRB takes to turn something around. The FDA, actually, surprisingly, you may be surprised here, tends not to hold on to these for too long. It can take a couple of weeks sometimes, but it's usually pretty quick. But then, the company has their process. They have to approve it. There may be a medical review there. And so, I would not expect this to be a rapid way to get a treatment for your desmoid. But the compassionate access pathway in specific circumstances can move faster.
Mm-hmm. Something, Manish, sorry, I just thought of something that might be important for some people. I had been on this drug previously. I knew that it was beneficial to me. I'm sure there are a lot of people who are looking into this, who are looking at a drug they've never tried before. And so I think just taking that into consideration as well, that if you don't know what is going to happen, just factor that into the stress or the mental weight of it all, because I knew what I was getting into, right? I knew what was coming if I finally got access to that drug. And I don't know in what way, how much or how little the fact that I had been on this drug and did well might have helped me in my case or not. I really don't know that was part of it, but I just wanted to put that out there, that I kind of knew what I was getting into.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think one of the common things from this session and the clinical trials one was that this is still experimental, right? It's still an experimental drug. So if you haven't had it before, you don't know how it's going to affect you. And it might affect people different. So I think one of the keys here is really having these conversations with your care team or your providers. And if that means going to Desmoidian or Google to get some more information, patient empowerment, I think, is important.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Very enlightening. Really appreciate it. Dr. Ratan and Amanda, thanks so much for being with us today.